Since it's been several months since the last proper Ellie-mentary, how about I do something special? That's right, this episode is a triple feature. Ellie-mentary presents the stories written around music by a specific band that were turned into home media from 2007 to 2009. 3-pack. Mamma Mia is a show that uses its inclusion of the music of ABBA as a crutch to tell a story that's messy and doesn't actually manage to say anything powerful. Calling it a feminist work is an overstatement, I think, because while Mamma Mia may have its female leads do most of the talking, the story is far too concerned with straight love. Marriage is still a when, not an if. The one explicitly gay relationship is entirely irrelevant, the epitome of queer table scraps. The show, which is not shy about its embrace of open sexuality, ends with the lead character getting to have 3 hot dads. I don't want to talk about it anymore. I realize I wrote this whole bit about the movie Mamma Mia 2008, and I realized I haven't actually seen Mamma Mia since 2008, so I'm gonna watch it again just to make sure that what I have to say isn't just the shitty opinions of a teenager from 2008. So yeah. ... Okay, so update. We just watched Mamma Mia. I'm not changing anything in the script. But I do want a sparkly Meryl Streep jumpsuit now.
It's time to move on.
Across the Universe is another show that uses its featured music as the main selling point to tell its underwhelming story. This time the music is all written by the Beatles, and the narrative doesn't really say anything beyond war is bad, police are bad, and something the power of love. Which, yes, but also maybe psychedelic movie musical with cardboard characters isn't the best way to send that message? I don't know, maybe the sequel will retroactively make it make sense. I actually really like the Beatles, and I know that the 2 living Beatles said that they liked it, so fuck me, I guess. But just like Mamma Mia makes the experience of listening to ABBA's music a little bit worse, so too does Across the Universe recontextualize the music of the Beatles in a way that doesn't enhance the experience at all. So, the HBO series Flight of the Conchords is not those other things. There's a number of obvious differences between Flight of the Conchords and the movie musicals I just mentioned. Mamma Mia and Across the Universe were not written by the musicians themselves. They were written by fans, and so rely on an outside interpretation of the art that inspired them. Whereas Flight of the Conchords actually stars and is written by the band. Conchords is also comedic at its core, designed to be funny in an absurd way, while Mamma Mia and Across the Universe clearly take themselves very seriously as works of art. For as serious as Bono from U2 singing I Am the Walrus, Gook Gook Jube is as an artistic statement. And of course, this HBO series is a series. It has 2 whole seasons of television with many varying plots to say what it wants to, rather than having to cram the whole vision into 2 hours. I really don't think it's fair to compare these works together as though they're all trying to be the same thing. When it comes to stories written around music by a specific band that were turned into home media from 2007 to 2009, I really don't care so much about who wore it best. I really just want to ask, why wear it at all? If you weren't already aware, Flight of the Conchords is made up of Jermaine Clement and Brett McKenzie, 2 comedic actors and musicians from New Zealand. After finding success in the early 2000s with their live performances and a radio series, they were picked up by HBO to make a 2-season television show, which is the focus of this review. There's a lot more to the band's history, and I could go on to gush about some of their other appearances before and after the TV show, but as fascinating as that rabbit hole is, I really think the show is the only part I have anything substantial to talk about. Flight of the Conchords follows a fictionalized version of Brett and Jermaine, who have come to New York City to try and find success as a band. They work with their incompetent band manager Murray, try to learn about American culture through wannabe expert Dave, deal with their stalker and soul fan Mel, and try to survive in the big city off their niche musical hobby. The tone of the show is very low-key for the most part, as the majority of the jokes are delivered deadpan without much in the way of drama. In fact, instances of loud music, animated actors, and generally high energy are most often used to contrast the reserved demeanor of Brett and Jermaine. The 2 are impressionable, and mostly just react to the world around them while struggling to have a significant impact on it. But when they do get to be expressive and high energy, that's when you can expect to be graced with some of their music. Once again, Flight of the Conchords is a comedy band, and their songs are genuinely really funny. I've been consistently quoting them since the show came out, and own physical copies of both of their full-length albums. But I have to concede that even though most of the songs are funny, few of them are, actually enjoyable music for me to listen to. Most of the tracks were written prior to the show's inception, so of course they had to fit the music into the script in some capacity. But usually when a song appears, it's painfully obvious that the plot was written clumsily around the song, which makes the plot worse, or the song is shoehorned in where it kinda makes sense, but not enough to justify being there for a full 2 or 3 minutes. So here's how I want to talk about Flight of the Conchords today. I want to discuss each episode individually, not spoiling the major plot developments except where necessary. And as I go, I'm going to be ranking all of the songs, from S tier, the highest honor, all the way down to F tier, which is reserved for the hot garbage. My criteria will be on how funny it is, both in the context of the show and out, as well as if it's musically interesting and flows nicely in the episode where it's featured. So for example, I think the show's instrumental theme song belongs in C tier, because it's pretty boring, but I don't dislike it enough to skip it, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. C for Conchords. Let's get started with episode 1.
Sally.
Brett and Jermaine go to a party, and from across the room, Jermaine sees a woman named Sally and begins to sing "The Most Beautiful Girl in the Room," partly as an internal monologue and partly to Sally directly. It's cute, it's funny as hell, and it works. It really makes a strong promise for the rest of the show, that it'll mix deadpan comedy with sitcom plots and musical interludes tastefully. An S-tier start. S for start. Truthfully, this just might be the best episode of the series. It introduces the characters in a way that's very natural and tells you everything you need to know. The songs that are featured feel just organic enough to work, but absurd enough to be funny in a uniquely Conchords way. It's a near-perfect pilot. My only big gripe is how there's a montage that makes visual references to the show's intro sequence, which is funny in its own way, but I really think those jokes would have landed harder if this were, not the very first episode. Like if the audience had some time to get accustomed to seeing Jermaine on the exercise bike in this specific way. It's a nitpick, but generally, Sally is a great introduction to the series. It's really impressive considering how a lot of other TV pilots are so concerned with setup that they kinda don't stick the landing. The other songs featured in the pilot are Robots, which is filmed as a low-budget music video in the episode, A tier, A for Android, and Not Crying, which is very funny and works well in context, but not quite perfectly. B tier. B for Ballin'.
Britt gives up the dream.
Episode 2 begins with Brett and Jermaine lamenting that they're having a hard time surviving in New York, resorting to eating food they found in the garbage and breaking into the song Inner City Pressure, which is a funny song, but it's the first of many to feel very forced into the narrative. It's written in the second person and doesn't really flow with the scene that came before it in spite of the thematic through line. Kind of a bop though, so I'll put it in B tier. B for Big City Anxiety. Brett gets a job as a sign holder, but Jermaine and Murray aren't happy about it, even though the job is necessary to live. We get another romantic subplot between Brett and Coco, one of his coworkers, accompanied by Boom, which gets a passing grade from me, but still drags just a little. B tier. B for Boom. This episode introduces some friendly rivalry between the main cast from New Zealand and the Australians, who keep showing them up at every opportunity. I am not in a position to speak on the relationship between people from New Zealand and Australia, but it does come up a lot in the series.
Mugged.
I like how this episode draws a distinct line between the aesthetics of being from the streets and actually being from the streets. Brett and Jermaine come up with rap names and act tough, but when faced with a couple of guys who do fit the bill, they turn out to be all talk, surprising nobody. Hip-Hopopotamus versus Rhymenoceros is fun at first, but even though the whole privileged white guys trying to rap bit is fully self-aware, self-awareness isn't enough to carry it. It gets a C tier from me. C for culturally insensitive. The episode pretty much has one plot point, and that's that Brett leaves Jermaine behind when they get mugged, and too much of the episode is dedicated to everyone else shaming Brett over it. And it's funny the first couple of times, but there's 4 or 5 whole scenes dedicated to that right in a row. Think About It is another forced song toward the end, and it's set up with Brett leaving by himself, since Jermaine is still upset, but when the song is over, Jermaine's with him, and that's not really explained at all. That said, the song itself is a great satire, so I'll put that in B tier. B for Brain, the place you think from. There's also a lot of writing in this episode that draws you into a typical we're not so different kind of dynamic between the Conchords and the duo who mug them, but then subverts that expectation repeatedly by saying, actually, we're not the same at all. These are a couple of guys who mug people just because they enjoy it, and one of them is a white supremacist. The idea that these two sets of friends are even similar enough to be compared is incredibly off base. And hey, good on this episode for not glorifying the police and for calling out white supremacy as the deplorable thing that it is, even if crime itself is still mischaracterized on the whole.
Yoko.
Brett's relationship with his girlfriend Coco gets more serious, but Jermaine keeps tagging along for their dates. The show already did this bit where the two of them go on dates when the other is there, and it certainly won't be the last time they do it either. The bit peaks in this episode with the song If You're Into It, which Brett writes about all of the things he would do just for Coco, with some input from Jermaine to keep it more realistic. S-tier track for sure. S for Stu, Coco's roommate. The episode is largely about how Murray and Jermaine don't like that Brett has a girlfriend and begin calling her Yoko because they feel entitled to Brett's time. Thankfully, this is played for the absurdity that it is, and apart from Coco being a delightful character struggling to exert her own agency amidst all of this buffoonery, this episode is a bit uninteresting otherwise. Pencils in the Wind has a strong start but drags on toward the end. As much as I personally enjoy that one, it's going into C tier. C for Coco.
Sally Returns.
Sally Returns is another episode revolving around a love interest for the Conchords, this time with the same Sally who appeared in the first episode. She's dated both Brett and Jermaine at this point, and now the two of them are trying to get back together with her even though she's engaged and Brett is still dating Coco. One of the band's most popular tracks, Business Time, appears here. Jermaine sings in a deep, sexy tone while fantasizing about having a mundane sexual experience while living with Sally. It's a really funny track and it's popular for a reason, but it doesn't do anything that musically interesting, and it's not one that I personally vibe with unless I'm like showing it to someone else. And its place in the episode is fine, but it doesn't feel as fluid as some of the other songs. It's fun to get a peek into Jermaine's head and learn that his idea of a good sexy time is actually pretty boring, but in terms of plot, nothing happens. We already knew that he wanted to get back together with Sally again. Still gets B tier for just being as funny as it is. B for business. The other song is called Song for Sally, where Brett and Jermaine try to one-up each other to win Sally's affection, and it's a great number. It's relevant to the story, laugh-out-loud funny, has a pleasant sound, and it's a really well-executed concept. It's a shame they never did a studio recording of this one, because it's an easy favorite for me. A tier. A for attention-seeking.
Bowie.
Brett's feeling body-conscious, and is visited in his dreams multiple times by David Bowie, played by Jermaine, who gives him advice. There's a little music video for an original song simply called Bowie, which might be funny. I'm not really that familiar with the works of David Bowie, so I don't get the references. Either way, it's a bit pointless and doesn't really fit. C tier. C for cheap reference. This episode also has the song Brett You've Got It Going On, which Jermaine sings to Brett to cheer him up, and it's really funny, it gets an A tier. A for affirming. But it's worth noting that the show as a whole really leans on a very strong kind of no-homo vibe from the Conchords and the people around them. It seems like the kind of thing that'd be played for a laugh and poke fun at how uptight and homophobic those kind of sentiments are, but at times it's difficult to tell whether they're reinforcing them or pushing back on them. And when a piece of writing fails to make that distinction clear, it's not really doing a good job of either thing.
Drive-by.
This episode guest stars Aziz Ansari, so let's get out our collective groans. This episode was also directed by Taika Waititi, so let's get out our collective perking up slightly. Ansari plays a fruit vendor who vocally discriminates against the Conchords for being from New Zealand. During the episode, there are a lot of instances where people treat them poorly because of where they're from, and this is admittedly a difficult episode to wrap my head around. Of course, xenophobia in America against people from New Zealand is not a big, rampant issue. There's always a touch of bigoted resentment against foreigners, generally. But as a group of people who are largely white and speak English, the amount of hate that they face is really a non-issue compared to non-white, non-English speaking people. So the fact that the show frames it as a big issue has me a little conflicted because on the one hand, this is a comedy show. It basks in the absurd and subverts the audience's expectations regularly. So the premise of an Indian American man being the one to accost our Kiwi leads for not belonging is definitely in line with the rest of the show. Remember that reverse racism, or the myth that a dominant population can be oppressed by a marginalized one, is not a real thing. On the other hand, all media has messaging, and it's always a worthwhile pursuit to uncover what that messaging is, regardless of authorial intent or genre. So what is the messaging here? Racism bad? Sure, that's a message here. We get to see our protagonists undergo a fictionalized version of oppression in a way that's satirized such that a viewer seeing that oppression as justified would be ludicrous. At the same time, this is a show that already has a predominantly white cast. So the fact that one of the only non-white actors plays an overtly antagonistic role isn't great, even if it is specifically an actor who deserves it. And to spoil the episode a bit, the fruit vendor eventually becomes friendly with the Conchords after he learns that they're not Australians like he had assumed, which is a pretty funny bit, but it kinda relies on the audience knowing their shit about xenophobia and racial oppression in order to stick the landing. And I'd argue that most people don't know their shit. I don't even know my shit, and I knew even less of my shit back in 2007. The thing about this episode that worries me isn't the jokes or the setup or anything, ableist slurs notwithstanding, but mostly that it seems to ignore the plight of actually oppressed groups of people in order to make this blanket statement about racism being ridiculous and arguably not even real. The pervasive idea that internalized racism and systemic racism is a thing that only existed in the past is dangerous. This episode, for all of its good intentions, actually encourages that idea rather than combating it in any meaningful way. A final note is that the song "I'll Be the Racist Dragon" appears here, which is another staple of the Conchords' catalog. It's meant to be a satire of overly preachy children's media, where a dragon realizes that hating people who are different is bad and suddenly becomes not racist anymore. It pokes fun at the idea of people magically dropping their prejudice when presented with reality, which is a valid satire. Bigots don't just stop being bigots when they see people getting hurt. And I wonder whether the producers of Drive-By understood the disconnect between the satire that's present in Albie and the messaging behind the actual episode. Again, credit where it's due, the song is very funny, but it's best experienced as a part of the live show and not in the TV show, because it really falls flat in this context. B tier on its own, D tier in this episode, so we'll split the difference and say C tier. C for commentary. Mother Uckas gets a C tier as well. Barely fits, only funny ones. C for censored. Anyway, the saving grace of this episode is that we get to hear Rhys Darby sing his own song about yearning for the tech support woman. It's got great callbacks to earlier in the episode and makes clever use of office supplies for percussion. What a treasure. Leggy Blonde gets an A tier. A for A. Rhys Darby gets a song.
Girlfriends.
It's fascinating to me that this episode occurs immediately after Drive-By because they both do a similarly yikes thing with their comedy versus messaging. Before I jump back into bummers, let's get Fudufafa out of the way. It's perfect. S tier for being funny and weird in the exact moment and manner that funny and weird is called for. S for Sacre Bleu.
Beautiful!
Brett and Jermaine get together with a couple of women and their experiences are wildly different, where Jermaine wants to be intimate with Felicia, who isn't really interested in him, and Brett doesn't want to be intimate with Lisa, who constantly coerces him into it. Lisa lies, gaslights, and manipulates Brett just to get laid, only to leave him as just another score. This episode uses a trope inversion to address sexual assault and manipulation, by putting a man into a position where he's the victim of foul play, where a woman would usually be the victim. This messaging is meant to show how messed up it is that this scenario is all too common for women, where they're objectified and used for sex. We see this happen to Brett, make the connection that this is a thing that women deal with, laugh at the absurdity, and walk away with a little more sympathy. This would work out just fine if it weren't for the fact that men do have to deal with sexual assault and coercion. Like, a lot. It's a hugely pervasive issue that gets swept under the rug because of our societal norms that tell men that they're weak if they're not in full control, or that it's not possible for a man to have sex that they don't want. Never mind the fact that the show often paints Brett as the small, more feminine of the Conchords. There have been jokes in previous episodes about how people see Brett as weedy, shy, boring, and lacking in self-confidence. The gender subversion doesn't really work when Brett is shown to be the kind of guy that men in the real world would criticize and victim blame for his own sexual assault. Girlfriends is an episode that misses its own point so hard by trying to be an absurd scenario that challenges misogynist stereotypes while simultaneously reinforcing them. The song A Kiss Is Not a Contract is featured here as one of the more natural and less forced musical breaks. As the title implies, it's about how taking one step in a relationship is not necessarily a commitment to do anything further. It's not laugh out loud funny, but it's a sweet sentiment that, for the purpose of messaging, really should have gone at the end because it's massively overshadowed by the episode's clumsy conclusion. C tier. C for consent.
What goes on tour?
Brett and Jermaine fuck a lot of things up, and Murray has to pay for it all. They meet up with a women's water polo team and compare them to mermaids, so the mermaid song happens, which is pretty good, but loses points for being out of place. The only reason it's going into C instead of B is because it's not available as a fully produced and purchasable track. C for Cowards! Release the full track!
New fans.
Just gonna come right out and say that the song Ladies of the World is musically forgettable, incredibly forced, and making references to hermaphrodites and lady man ladies is completely uncalled for. I don't have any nuanced critique, just D tier. D for do better. The Conchords have a couple of new fans who invite them over to do acid, and we get the song Prince of Parties, which serves as little more than a haha, drugs are so random and funny joke, which I've just been over for as long as I can remember. C tier. C for can you not? The fans invite Brett and Jermaine to have a threesome, which makes for an incredibly funny scene, even if it is out of character given how Brett behaves in the Girlfriends episode, and it's laced with those no homo vibes that leak into the whole show.
The actor.
Will Forte is the actor who plays the actor in The Actor, an episode where Murray feels dejected about how much of a failure he is for the band. Cheer Up Murray gets an easy S tier. S for supporting Murray. Brett and Jermaine task Forte's character Ben with pretending to be a record executive and giving Murray a confidence-boosting phone call. This is one of my absolute favorite episodes, so I super won't spoil it, but this is like my third or fourth rewatch of the series, and this episode in particular still puts me on the edge of my seat. The songs are funny and work perfectly, it's paced well, and Darby in less than 3 seconds gives the single most convincing, suddenly and irreparably furious performance I've ever seen. Oh, and Frodo gets B tier for relying on Lord of the Rings references, but fitting perfectly and being great for those who get them. B for Baggins.
The third Concord.
This episode is the finale of the first season, guest starring Todd Barry and Dimitri Martin as two musicians who become part of the band, then each separate into part of two bands, then part of their own band, creating the song Doggy Bounce, which to me is annoying and doesn't have much going on for it comedically. D tier. D for Doggo. Brett's Angry Dance is fully instrumental, so its comedic value is purely judged on its use in the show, so I give it a solid B tier. B for Brett's fucking pissed. Even though this episode is a great finale,
A good opportunity.
It's something of a two-parter with the premiere of the second season, and it's a great plotline. A Good Opportunity is a great episode in terms of how it follows up that finale, and also this one does a good job of addressing a societal problem in a funny and meaningful way. I'm not going to say why this song happens, but Rejected, as performed by Rhys Darby and Andrew Drost, gets B tier for the performance alone. B for bold vocals. Andrea Rosen and Greg Proops play a pair of advertising executives who get the Conchords to do a jingle for a brand of toothpaste made especially for women. Because the guys are, well, guys, their idea of a jingle for Femident essentially boils down to incredibly vague generalizations about women. It's great satire because it's absurd right from the start, and it's based on a real thing that happens in the magical world of late capitalism. Plus, this little subplot is nicely woven into the main plot that connects the episode with last season's finale. I can put the jingle into C tier for doing its job. C for crap, I ran out of room. I bring this up not because it's perfect. There are some jokes about the Conchords coming across as feminine, which don't really sit well when you consider the deeper implications there. And Angels, which the episode ends on, is particularly weak and forced, even though I secretly enjoy listening to it out of context. The only positive note I can give about the song is that at least they let the credits play over it. It gets F tier, but with an honorable mention for being a guilty pleasure for me personally. F for Fallen Angels. The episode as a whole demonstrates that the producers of the show are fully capable of doing satire well and responsibly. unlike in certain prior episodes.
The new cup.
The band needs to supplement their income after Brett buys a cup that makes all of their bill checks bounce. Jermaine decides to try being a prostitute with the expected amount of success. Sugar Lumps is a song about how women are just always objectifying men based on how sexy their balls are. It's delightfully absurd, and it's a real bop. It's not one of my personal favorites, but I have enough respect for it to plop it into A tier where it belongs. A for always after my lucky sugar lumps. You Don't Have to Be a Prostitute gets C tier for not being very funny, even though it does fit perfectly into the episode, and it's one of the more musically interesting tracks. C for criminalizing sex work is not cool, man. It's clear from this point that the second season is showing more promise than the first. But I won't give the episode too much credit. It still frames sex work as degrading at worst, silly at best.
The tough Brits.
Brett forms a gang to protect himself after he disses some rappers, and Murray gets teased by some members of the Australian consulate. There's a clear theme of hurt feelings, accompanied by the song Hurt Feelings, which is performed and later gets a reprise in the episode, and earns an A tier from me. A for apologize for hurting their feelings. There isn't any conclusion regarding these hurt feelings, which is a shame because it would have been cool to see a handful of unique outcomes given the multiple subplots the episode gives us. There's a deleted scene that wraps up one of the plots, but it's, deleted. Not canon. The only one with a resolution is where Mel makes a painting of Jermaine that he doesn't want, and he pretends that he likes it when she catches him trying to throw it away. I guess the conclusion is supposed to be that there are some people who are better off being lied to than having their feelings hurt, which is bad. Anyway, Stay Cool is a treat. A tier. A for Australians.
Murray takes it to the next level.
Murray wants to become better friends with the Conchords, so he introduces them to his friend Jim, played by Jim Gaffigan. It's an all-around fun and innocent episode which pokes fun at the idea of friendship labels in an endearing way. The most frustrating thing about this episode is the song Dreams, where Mel sings about her completely expected fantasies involving Brett and Jermaine. Forced, not funny, yet clearly produced with a higher budget than some of the other songs featured in the show. And that's not any fault of Kristen Schaal. She performs the song just fine and plays the character of Mel perfectly as always. This song is just more of the same, and it's not memorable. F tier. F for fantasies. Fortunately, the song Friends at the episode's conclusion more than makes up for it. B tier. B for best friends.
Unnatural Love.
The episode begins with Too Many Dicks on the Dance Floor, a song about how letting too many guys into the club makes things weird and uncomfortable for everyone. I actually ranked this lower initially, but I was convinced to move it up to C tier after deliberating with my girlfriend. It still has some of that no homo energy, but ultimately it's a harmless song. I don't like the equating of men to dicks, but even though it rubs me a little strangely and doesn't do anything for me musically, I can concede that it's well composed and fun to listen to. And the message is relatable for people of all genders. My biggest gripe is that it doesn't really work in the episode's context all that well. C for cocks, which is a word that is often used in a similar way as the word dicks. Anyway, Jermaine starts going out with a woman from Australia, and everyone around him disapproves. This episode is full of what I can only hope is playful ribbing between New Zealand and Australia, because if it's not, and it's actually offensive, that will completely blindside me, and I'm sorry for talking it up so much in that case, because I think it's really funny. Jermaine sings Carol Brown, a song about how his heart was broken by previous lovers, and apart from a brief homophobic joke, it's a funny piece where Jermaine tries to evoke sympathy before all of his exes sing about how he totally deserved to be dumped. A tier. A for abandonment.
Boo! Too Many Dicks was robbed!
Love is a weapon of choice.
Kristen Wiig plays a woman who loses her epileptic dog, and Brett and Jermaine both pretend to care deeply about dogs with epilepsy in order to gain her affection. I remember liking this episode a lot when it was new, but on rewatch it's something of a repeat of Sally Returns, but with some fresh jokes. We're Both in Love with a Sexy Lady is an A tier song. A for attraction. Love is a Weapon of Choice is F tier. F for forced. And epileptic dogs is B tier? B for Bork.
Prime Minister.
The Conchords do a Simon & Garfunkel tribute gig, and Jermaine gets involved with a woman played by Marilyn Rajskub with an Art Garfunkel fetish. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister of New Zealand visits, and Murray serves as his aide. Seeing Patton Oswalt in this episode is a treat, and watching Chloe from 24 act as an Art Garfunkel fetishist, what a phrase, is something I didn't know I needed. It's a good episode, but the music super doesn't fit. Demon Woman is tied in the loosest possible way, so it gets a D tier. D for demon. It's one of the words in the title. And Oh Dance Baby is something. C tier. C for Korean. Wait a minute.
New Zealand Town.
Brett and Jermaine start using hair gel and suddenly become cool. Prime Minister Brian helps establish New Zealand Town as part of New York. Lucy Lawless is in this one. Fashion is Danger gets B tier. It works well enough in context and it's one of my favorites musically, but it's not exceptionally funny. B for Bangs.
Wingman.
Rambling Through the Avenues of Time opens this episode, and this one gets an easy S tier. S for Story Time. It's clever, funny, and actually works perfectly as a lead-in to the rest of the episode, where Brett tries to get together with a pet store worker he doesn't have the confidence to talk to. This episode is good all around. It's proper satire, and the creepiness of Brett's behavior towards Savannah is adequately handled at the end. I Told You I Was Freaky gets an A tier, losing points only because it's not a perfect segue in the context of the show, but it's definitely one of the funniest. A for abnormal, which Google thinks is a synonym for kinky somehow.
Evicted.
Evicted is the series finale, so named because the Conchords are evicted from their apartment and end up staying with Mel and her husband Doug. Brett has a weird nightmare sequence as the song Petra, Yelena, and Me, which is stylized, reasonably funny, and visually impressive, but doesn't really work in the episode. C tier. C for cannibalism. Meanwhile, Murray puts together a stage musical about the Conchords' life in a last-ditch attempt to get them famous and successful. The final major act of the show is Murray's musical, which is every bit as silly and endearing as it ought to be, so it gets a respectable A tier. A for applause. It's really late, I'm gonna not. That's my episode-by-episode analysis and nearly complete tier list, but there are a lot of elements that are worth discussing with regards to the series as a whole. I think there's something to be said about just how often the show's plot revolves around the Conchords' on-off relationships with women. One could feasibly make the argument that the entire show is more or less about a couple of Kiwis trying to get laid in New York. In fact, the first episode is not only titled Sally and centered around one such plot, but the very first sentence in the entire show is,
"Man, back in New Zealand, I was getting it on with lots of chicks."
I don't like that the female characters don't really have a purpose beyond their relationship to Brett and Jermaine, and the only exceptions that come to mind are one-off characters like Paula, the New Zealand ambassador, and the occasional one or two line bit role. The show only sometimes finds it necessary to work a woman into the story who behaves in a respectable or at least normal way. Coco pushes back against all of Brett and Jermaine's weirdness with little success until she finally has a breaking point. Coco is my favorite side character in the series, but she only sticks around for 3 episodes, and her role is ultimately still as one of Brett's many girlfriends. Savannah is another reasonably fun character, but again, her primary purpose is to just be one of Brett's lovers, and she's only there for 1 episode. She takes her work seriously, she's approachable when Brett starts to talk to her, and she likes to have an exceptionally freaky good time. But when she finds out that Brett's been effectively stalking her, she has enough agency to put her foot down and say enough is enough. And I guess while we're on that subject, we should talk about Mel. Like I said before, Mel is played to absolute perfection by Kristen Schaal. Mel's behavior is unambiguously awful. She waits for the Conchords outside their front door, breaks into their apartment when they're away, follows them when they travel, picks the lock to the door when they're in the bathroom, makes unwanted sexual passes. I really could go on. I've had some pretty scary fans, and I can say with some degree of certainty that Mel is the perfect embodiment of the fan nobody wants to have. And I say perfect because it's easy to write a character who just does all of the wrong things. But in particular, Mel is put into a very specific position of power. She is the sole fan of the Conchords. They would have no fans without her. And every so often, the band has to rely on Mel when nobody else will help them. So they have to put up with her outlandish behavior. And from a creative standpoint, she's a great balance of insufferable and charming. Cringe humor done right, largely thanks to Shaw's mastery of micro-expressions and subtlety. Or I guess wordlessly making it look like a character is trying to be subtle about something and failing at it. I'm not really sure if there's a word for that. She's the only main and consistently recurring female character in the entire series. But for all of the skill we could attribute to Mel's writing and performance, ultimately she is still the band's fan, the band's stalker, the band's last hope, a character who must exist relative to the band. And relative to her husband Doug, I suppose, who is a great counter to Mel's outrageousness and who is a character who I always get emotional seeing on screen because he also played Gale in Breaking Bad and just... I can't talk about it. It's a bummer because we never get to see Mel have a plot that's all her own. Practically everything she does is either because of the band or her doing something to the band. And maybe that's meant to show us something. In a way, it tells us that Mel's life is sad, that she's so desperate to have her life validated by these men, and she acts so outlandishly to accomplish it, and how that's no way to live. Maybe we as the audience are intended to look at Mel as a cautionary tale about more than just not acting in a blatantly disrespectful and self-serving way. We're also invited to take pity on Mel for being so helplessly attached to the Conchords and to, in our own lives, find a way to live independently and pursue our own paths rather than latching onto the paths of those we admire. The whole show, in a way, is about people who aren't living their best lives. Stalking is all Mel knows. Doug isn't doing anything of note from what we can observe and is too afraid of Mel to admonish her behavior. Murray's home life is a mess, and he can't manage the band properly no matter what he tries. Brett and Jermaine constantly struggle with their love lives, their musical passion, and even their ability to just get by. Dave lives with his parents and constantly lies about all of the cool things he's done. In fact, of everyone, Dave seems to be the only one who's arguably doing alright for himself. We're invited to see him as pathetic, but despite that, he has an unwavering confidence and a steady job. As far as he's concerned, he is living that fantasy life he tells everyone about. Advanced spoiler warning for the final episode of the show here, but I think that Flight of the Conchords as a whole is meant to be inspiring in an unorthodox way. Nihilism is, to put it broadly, a belief that life has no inherent meaning. I like to think that someone who considers themselves a nihilist will be of a mind to either A, give up, surrendering themselves to a life of misery and never aspiring to anything, or B, realize that because life has no inherent meaning, that it's worthwhile to imbue that meaning into life themselves, pursuing as much joy for themselves and for others as possible. Nihilism turned hedonism, if you will. Throughout the show, Brett and Jermaine try so very desperately to make a cultural dent in the world and fail at every turn. The world wants them to fail. The final episode of the show, Evicted, opens with Brett and Jermaine waking up in their apartment, a place where no measure of real personal fulfillment has ever been attained across 22 episodes. But in this place, Brett and Jermaine start making music with everything around them, drumming on the radiator, using the alarm clock as a metronome, and tapping on whatever they can find to keep the song going. The episode ends with Brett and Jermaine being deported back to New Zealand and being forced into their former lives as shepherds. And what do? I'm counting these as B tier for being endearing and functional. B for beats. Partway through Evicted, Murray shows the band the script for his musical about their lives, which Jermaine describes as a rags to rags to rags story. And that's absolutely true about this fictional version of the Conchords. The show aims to be a collection of good jokes primarily, but in a way, it's a message about how you can find joy in the small things, no matter where you are, or what your situation is. And that blows, doesn't it? The real Flight of the Conchords have found massive success both in and out of the band. Why are they the ones telling us that we should be happy even if the world screws us out of success? HBO gave them money to make their own TV show. They got to show off their entire catalog of music on the show, they got all these high-profile actors to guest star in it, they have this cult following now, and they are telling us to just be happy with what we've got and leave success to the lucky? They can't even subvert the rags to riches cliche without turning it into some bullshit about being complacent with the shitty laborer's life that the average person is burdened with. But then again, no? I mean, the fictional Conchords may be our sympathetic leads, but they're also our pathetic leads. They're not really supposed to be an example of how to live. Most of their failed attempts at success are their own fault. They're kind of idiots. So maybe this ending is trying to tell us that only an idiot would be complacent and not try to change things? I don't know. Analyzing Flight of the Conchords is a chore, and I'm ready to just sweep it under the rug and call this episode done. Flight of the Conchords is a funny show, but it's not above using slurs, evidently. The music works sometimes, misses a lot, and its messaging is too all over the place to summarize. The show really best serves as a collection of good jokes, and trying to hold it up as much more than that feels dishonest. I don't think you'd be wasting your time if you watch it, but if you'd rather skip it in favor of something else, I wouldn't argue with you either. And I guess when it comes to being a story written around music by a specific band that was turned into home media from 2007 to 2009, it doesn't not work.
It's a musical like Mamma Mia.
Like Mamma Mia.
But this is your musical.
Yeah. Look around the room, I can tell that you are the most beautiful girl in the room. In the whole wide world. And when you're on the street, depending on the street, I bet you are definitely in the top 3. Yeah, depending on the street. And when I saw you at my mate's place, I thought, well, yes, she do. At my mate's place, how did they get a party like that to a party like this? Good morning. You're a legend, Dave.
Rock the Party gets B tier because while it may be short and not a real song, it serves the show well as the placeholder song for when the Conchords need to be playing a song, and I love how much mileage they get out of it. B for boobies.